Hello and welcome to the Absolute Beginner Guitar Lesson Series. My name is Oliver and today's lesson is lesson number 28. And today's lesson is actually going to be a fairly short lesson, at least by my standards. So I hope you have your guitar out, tuned up to standard pitch, and we might as well get into it. So the subject of today's lesson is adding notes that are on the A and E strings to your chords. Now, for some of you who may be just stumbling onto this lesson, who hasn't, followed the lesson series, it may seem a little ridiculous to hear me say that, but if there's anyone who has been following these lessons and has been working with the material, they'll know that we began with playing our chords on 3 strings, and since then we've expanded, and we covered adding notes on the D string. So now I want to talk about adding notes that are on the A and the E strings. I'm not going to get into going over the notes that are on the strings. By this point, anyone who has followed these lessons now has the ability to essentially find any note that they want on the guitar. So determining the notes on the strings, that's something that you don't need me to go through for you because you probably have that ability already. So really what I want to talk about is adding notes that are on the A string and the E string to some of the chord fingerings that we've been working with is really a simple matter, as long as you know the notes that are in the chord. And that's the key. So I'm just going to start with the C major chord. And for anyone who's not aware, the notes of the C major chord are C, E, and G. And the order of the notes doesn't matter. As long as you have the notes C, E, and G, and no other notes present, you will have a C major chord. And the way we started things out in the series is we started with chords that were on 3 strings. We were just using the first 3 strings of the guitar, the E, the B, and the G strings. And the very first chord that I showed in lesson number 5 was a C major chord that had its root note at the first fret of the B string. And we played it with the E, B, and the G strings. And we have the E note, which is the open E string, the C note, which is a note at the first fret on the B string, which is also the root note. And then we have the open G string. So we have the 3 notes of our chord. And in the last lesson where I talked about adding notes that were on the D string to the chord, we learned that we could add the E note at the 2nd fret of the D string. And now we have a 4-note C major chord. Well, adding notes on the A string is really not a difficult thing. Really, all we need to do is we need to look for a note that's in our chord that's on the A string and somewhere close to where we're fingering our chord. And I can find the C note, the root note, on the 3rd fret of the A string. And I'm going to reach up with my ring finger and I'm going to play that note. And when we add this note, now we have a 5-string C major chord. Now this is probably the most popular chord that's ever been played, and it's the way that a lot of people learn how to play. Someone shows them this 5-string C major chord and tells them to put their fingers in the various locations, and they learn the chord. And that's a fine way to learn the chord. The approach that I've taken is a little bit different because it's been knowledge based, and that's because I knew how to play a C chord long before I knew the notes that were in the C chord. So anyway, I don't want to get away from it. Most people learn this 5-string version of the C major chord. However, we can add in the E string if we want to, as long as we understand the notes of the chord. And the E note, the open E note, E is actually in the C major chord. So I can take this 5-string version, and if I want, I can simply add the open E string. Now I have my E note as the lowest note of the chord, which is a little bit different than when you play it with your C note as the lowest note of the chord, but it's still an E chord. And if I look a little bit closer, I might see that at the 3rd fret on the E string, I have the G note, which is in the C chord. So if I want, I can add that in. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch around where I was using my ring finger. I'm going to replace that with my pinky finger, and then I'm going to reach up with my ring finger, and I can play the G note that's at the 3rd fret on the E string. And now I have another version of the C major chord. And if you listen, these versions of the chords sound different than what you may be used to hearing. However, they're still C major chords and they can be used. And I think it's important for beginners or anyone that's trying to learn to understand that songwriters often will use chord fingerings that aren't necessarily the most popular versions of the chord. They like to, be able to give their chords a little bit of a different sound to them. So it's important to keep your mind open to the different ways that you can play these chords. And this works for any chord that we know. If we stick to open string fingerings, we could say, for example, go with the A minor chord. The first version of the A minor chord that I showed was essentially a 3-string version where we played on the G, B, and the E strings. However, as we saw in the lesson on adding notes on the D string, I can add in the E note that's in the 2nd fret, on the 2nd fret of the D string. And now I've turned my chord into a 4-string A minor chord. So now again, to add notes that are on the A string and the E strings are just a matter of finding notes that are in our chord that happen to fall on those strings in a place where we can reach them with our fingers. And now we're dealing with an A minor chord, and open A string represents the root note of the chord. So when I add that open A string, I have the 5-string version of the A minor chord. And this is the version of the A minor chord that I first learned. And again, it's probably the version of the chord that most people learn. But when I learned the A minor chord, I didn't know the notes of the chord. I just memorized where to put my fingers. However, if you know the notes of the chord are A, C, and E, it becomes not difficult at all to add those notes. And in reality, if I wanted to, I could add the C note that's at the 3rd fret of the A string. And instead of playing the open A string, I could reach up with my pinky and I could play the C note. And now I have another version of the chord. Again, this sounds different than what most people are used to, and it's not a simple fingering. But the reality is I can do it because I understand that that note is in the chord. And the same thing goes for adding notes that are on the E string. The E note is in the A minor chord. So I can add in the open E string if I want, and I can turn this chord into a 6-string version of my A minor chord. Again, it sounds different because we don't have the root note in the bass. However, it's still an A minor chord. And I'm not going to go through all of the open chords, but in reality, you can take all of your open chord fingerings that you've learned, and you can add these strings in to just about any of them. Now, you may have to reconsider how you're going to place your fingers, but what I want you to do is I want you to use your mind, and I want you to challenge yourself to be able to find these notes. Because once you find the notes, then you start to have a better understanding of these chords. And once you have an understanding of the instrument, you'll find that what you can do will open up to you, and you will be able to do things that you didn't think you were able to do before. The same thing applies to our closed fingerings. If I go to my F major chord fingering, where the root note is at the first fret on the E string, this is one of the fingerings that I taught, was a 3-string fingering, where we're using the G, B, and the E strings. However, as I showed in that lesson where we talked about adding a 4th string to the chords, I could add this F note that's at the 3rd fret on the D string, and now I turn my chord into a 4-note version of the chord. Now, most people learn this chord fingering and they stop here, but in reality, it's not difficult to add notes that are on D, A, or the E strings. The notes of the F major chord are F, A, and C. So the A note that the open A string represents is in the F major chord. So I could add that A note to this chord, and I have a 5-string version of the chord. Now, I also can recognize that the note C is in the F chord as well. And I have the C note at the 3rd fret on the A string. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bar and I'm going to extend my bar up beyond the first 2 strings. And the reason I don't want to do this is this makes it a little easier for me to reach up with these other fingers. And so where I have my fingering for my 4-string chord, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the note C that's at the 3rd fret of the A string. So what I'll do now is I will replace my ring finger with my pinky finger at the 3rd fret on the D string, and then I'm going to reach up with my ring finger and I'll play the C note that's on the 3rd fret of the A string. And now I have a 5-string version of my chord. And I can extend this further because I have the note F at the 1st fret of the E string. So now what happens is I'm going to take my bar and I'm going to extend it across all 6 strings. And I'm going to reach up and I'm going to add that in with my index finger to this 5-string fingering. And now it becomes a 6-string fingering. So these are, when you look at these 6-string fingerings or these 5-string fingerings, they may look familiar to you because they're commonly used fingerings. However, I've opted to sort of avoid starting you out with them because they're more difficult to play. And barring across 6 strings is going to be a challenge for you, as well as reaching up with your other fingers. What I would prefer that you do is I would prefer that you experiment around and that you add these strings slowly and get comfortable with them. And understand that there's no one set way to play any of these chords. It's important to avoid memorizing chord fingerings. There's nothing wrong with memorizing a chord fingering, but associating a chord with a specific chord fingering and thinking that, okay, if I know how to play this one version of the C chord, I know the C chord. And you can get along by knowing only one way to play the C chord. However, it's going to limit you. And depending on the type of sound that you are going for and the type of playing that you are doing, it may not be appropriate at all times. So I'm not going to go on really much further other than to say that adding these notes to your chords is just a matter of knowing the notes of the chords. And also that we've approached the guitar starting with the 1st string and adding in strings as we go along. So when we look at our F chord, I've had you look at the F as being at the root note at the first fret on the E string in the case of the fingering that I showed you. But any F note can be the root note of the chord. And the reality is there are inversions that exist all across the fretboard. And if you take a little time, what you can understand is you can form a chord essentially from most root notes. You can form most chords. So I can have my C root note at the third fret of the A string, and I can figure out how to make a C chord from there. All I need is C, E, and G. Well, I have the G note at the third fret on the E string. I can add that. I have the E note at the second fret on the D string. And guess what? If I play these three notes together, I have a C major chord. Now, that might not be the C major chord that you want for whatever particular application you may be pursuing, but it's important to understand that it's available and you can use it and you can change your sound up a little. So all I would ask you to do is to start out with your open string fingerings and find those notes that are on the A string and those notes that are on the E string that are appropriate to your chords, and discover the different ways that you can play your chords. The same thing with all your movable chord forms. They can be turned into 5-string chords or 6-string chords. So I'm just going to leave it at that, and I'm going to leave you to put in the work. So put in your time, put into your work, and I hope to see you at the next lesson. Peace.